so it's available for others. But
And one of the things you can do if you select speaker view, then you aren't recording everybody's backgrounds. So that's also a way we can have people's lovely faces stay on but not be recorded.
Thank you. Still learning all the tech of all this world. So welcome. I'm super excited that you're all joining me today. My name is Haley, and I'm a science educator at Chabot Space and Science Center. So I specialize in informal learning and in museum settings, outdoor education, and in nonprofit organizations. And I've been at Chabot Space and Science Center for about 2 years. So feel free to let me know in the chat if you've ever been to Chabot before. Right now, during the pandemic, we are not open to the public. We're working on kind of a grand reopening for the spring of 2021, crossing our fingers. And during this time, we have some of our virtual field trip offerings online available for teachers that are interested in purchasing those. And we also have weekly live science demonstrations that we do live with our virtual audience. The workshop that I'm going to work with you all today is actually a modification of a workshop we used to teach in previous years, focused on climate change and food specific in its role with climate change. And because we're not doing this workshop this year with any of our visitors or schools, we thought this would be a really good opportunity to share it with you. And this workshop is geared towards grades about 4th through 8th grade or above. It's really focusing in specifically on food and its role in climate change and how climate change impacts food production. And the assumption that we're making leading into this workshop is that the students that you might be working with or the students that we're working with already have some basic understanding of climate change. So what are the greenhouse gases that contribute to climate change? What are some of the effects that we're seeing of climate change and causes, which we'll briefly review in the beginning, but that's kind of just where we're coming into this workshop at to give you a good understanding of what would come in before. And during this workshop, I'll be teaching it as if I'm the educator and you're all the students. So I'll need your participation in a few of the activities and in the chat with responses. And then keep in mind, keep your teacher hats on. If you ever want to ask a question in the chat of like how you might modify this for your classroom or how might you present this to your classroom or your students, feel free to pop it in the chat. At the end, we'll have some discussion time focusing on how you might pull aspects of this for your class or how you might use this information to share it and modify or extend the learning for your class. So just keep that in mind. That's kind of how we're going to approach this today. And I'm willing to switch in and out of those gears at any moment. So yeah, just chat me if you have some questions while we go. Let me get my PowerPoint up here. And where is it? That would be helpful. One second. There we go. All right. So presentation today is called Food Footprints. Thank you all for already posting in the chat if you had your grade and your topic that you teach. I'm Haley. Woo, I'm a science educator. So let's get going. So today you are my group of students in my Food Footprints workshop. And because we're going to be talking a little bit how food production, transportation, waste contributes to climate change, let's start off just by getting an idea of kind of where you're all at with climate change. So go ahead and type into the chat what you think of when you think of climate change. If you have a good one-sentence explanation on what climate change is, feel free to type it in the chat. What are some factors of climate change? Let's just kind of have an open-ended share out here on what is climate change to you? What do you think of when you think of climate change? What do you know about it already?
Climate change is the climate changing due to natural and human Oops, sorry, it went too fast. Influences. James says the change in the Earth's environment. Alexis says it's the most important thing humans have to deal with now and in the future. Very important aspect. The change in the Earth's climate can be caused by pollution and greenhouse gas effects. So a lot of reference to the change aspect there. What does change? What's changing? Increases in temperature due to human activities. And then the social aspect coming up here makes students feel like they have no future. Human activity contributes to changes. So yeah, that's a really important part of teaching, right? How do we teach about this while, you know, instilling hope and a sense of agency for students?
All right, so pretty good overall. We're seeing some similar themes here. We're thinking lots of changes. Thank you, Teresa, for kind of reading out that chat for us. Looking at different factors of the Earth's climate changing, such as pollution, the social aspects of it, looking at greenhouse gases and how they contribute to that, and how that can be, you know, over a long time, that can be them, their kids, their grandchildren, generations to come. So overall, we're going to review climate change, and it seems like you all have a pretty good grounding on it. So we'll just do this quickly. But climate change is the Earth's natural systems. We see specific climates across our planet. So if you were to think of the long-term weather patterns that we're seeing that are occurring across the planet Earth, we see specific weather patterns over time that are predictable, that are aligning with the past and are used to predict the future. And what we're seeing is that those weather patterns, those long-term weather patterns, those climate systems that we're seeing are shifting. And they're not necessarily following the patterns of the past, but they're changing, and we're seeing that pattern as we move forward. Now, what does that have to do with this greenhouse effect? Well, the reason we're starting to see our climate shift and change is partly due to the shifting of greenhouse gases that we're seeing in Earth's atmosphere. So that atmosphere up there surrounding planet Earth, that invisible bubble of gases such as oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, methane, argon, all of these gases that are kind of creating this invisible bubble surrounding our planet. And what that atmosphere does is it creates this greenhouse effect. And if you've ever seen a greenhouse before or heard of a greenhouse, what those do is they actually help trap heat and warmth inside a place where you're growing food in order to allow the plants that are in there to be a safe temperature, to keep them from freezing, or to also increase humidity and to kind of control that climate within that little system. And the atmosphere does the same thing for our planet. If you think of planet Earth, it's sitting in space, which is really cold. It's kind of a vacuum. There's a lot of stuff going on out there. And the atmosphere works like this invisible bubble, keeping in heat from our sun. So it actually allows our planet to have a livable, comfortable temperature because of those greenhouse gases actually trap heat close to the planet that we live in. What we're seeing, though, is an excess of some of those greenhouse gases due to human activity, as someone mentioned in the chat, which is increasing the ability of our atmosphere to trap heat and specific conditions close to our planet. So we're seeing increased heat being trapped by that atmosphere. You could think of it like our atmosphere is a jacket. And as you put on more jackets, you're gonna get a little bit hotter. You're gonna be trapping more heat inside near your body. And that can also result in changes in other parts of our planet, such as the weather that we see day to day, the amount of storms that we see over time, the chemistry of our oceans and our water systems, and how these systems are interacting with one another, which is overall changing the climate that we're seeing across our planet. And you could go more or less in depth with this with your students, depending on where they're at. But we're going to focus on one greenhouse gas today, the one that we all like to talk about when we talk about climate change, which is carbon dioxide. And the reason we're going to talk about carbon dioxide is because it's one of the gases that we know is the most commonly produced by human activity. So let's think as a group together, what are some sources that we know carbon dioxide comes from. So what are some things on the planet that produce carbon dioxide?
Respiration.
Go ahead. What was that?
Respiration.
Yeah, we actually produce carbon dioxide naturally. We're all producing it right now as we exhale with our breath. Any other ideas? Where else does carbon dioxide come from? Angie says burning fossil fuels. Christina says cars.
Burning of fossil fuels, yeah.
Volcanism.
What was it?
Volcanism. Volcano.
Volcanism, yeah, from volcanoes. Certain specific natural processes like deep ocean vents also produce some greenhouse gases. I don't think they produce carbon dioxide though. Methane? Breathing, cars, coal-powered plants, decomposition, growing vegetables and fruits. Yeah, so we have lots of different sources of carbon dioxide, us being a natural one. Animals on the planet, we exhale carbon dioxide. We're a natural source of carbon dioxide, but there are human-made sources of carbon dioxide that are creating extra or excess. That excess carbon dioxide is what's shifting those different chemicals in our atmosphere. And some of the largest producers of that excess carbon dioxide, like you said, is the burning of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are things like coal, oil, and gas, which are natural elements extracted from the ground and then burned. And as they're burned, that carbon that's produced, that's packed inside of them, is burnt off as an emission, and that gas goes up into our atmosphere and can then change the composition of our atmosphere or can move throughout the rest of the planetary systems in different ways. So when we burn these fossil fuels, we're kind of contributing to that excess of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. And there's different amounts that you might produce. If we were to be able to actually see what carbon dioxide could look like as it's burning from, say, a car, or maybe a plane, or maybe from an entire city, we would actually be able to see this physical carbon dioxide gas as it is going up into our atmosphere, into our cities, and kind of creating this effect. And this is a really cool video. It's a super short clip, but it kind of helps us visualize what that looks like. And you can think if you could actually see that, that might change the way we view carbon dioxide emissions or other emissions of greenhouse gases like methane. But for this case, if you were to take, what we're going to focus on now is trying to track the amount of carbon dioxide that we produce. And this is in something called a carbon footprint. So if you've already heard of a carbon footprint before, feel free to share out like your definition of what a carbon footprint is. And I will share the video. I'll share all my slides once we're done here today. Yes, another big source of carbon dioxide is manufacturing of concrete and of specific materials, but concrete has like a wildly huge carbon footprint, which is kind of insane. But the carbon footprint that we're looking at can be of an individual person. This can be the collective amount of carbon dioxide that you emit as a person. So if any of you are familiar, there's lots of different carbon footprint calculators you can use online. You could use them with your students to have them walk through a day in their life and actually calculate their carbon footprint. But this can be a whole collection of actions that you take in a day. So every time you burn a fossil fuel, you're increasing your carbon footprint. That could be as easy as something as turning your light on in your apartment. That's using electricity, which is coming from a specific type of energy, most likely fossil fuel. Every time you drive, maybe to school or your parents drive you to school, that car is burning gasoline, which is a fossil fuel, which is increasing your carbon footprint. But you can also offset that carbon footprint by doing environmentally friendly actions like carpooling, recycling, and whatnot. So the carbon footprint of something is kind of its total carbon emissions in its existence. You can do this for people, but today we're going to try doing something like this for food. Before we do that, just to get you all thinking, where does our food actually come from? Feel free to type in the chat or unmute yourselves. I want you to think about the process of how we get food actually to our tables and to our plates. So where does food come from? What's its journey? It comes from a farm.
Mexico, California, South America, home gardens, the ground, factories, and transportation. Someone tosses out locally grown, ranching. Some people here are attending from areas that are big on ranching.
It's pretty cool. Restaurants as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we get our food from lots of different sources, and your students themselves might get their food from completely different areas. They might not even know where they get their food from. This is a really interesting question to ask, especially younger students. Like, where does food come from? It doesn't just appear in our homes, but it has a journey, it has a lifespan, and it kind of has like its own footprint. So we're going to get into our first actual activity, which is going to involve your participation as a group. And what we're going to do is we're going to try to figure out the carbon footprint of some food. So before we started this workshop, we asked you, DoorDash. Yes, some students might just say food just shows up at your door, which sometimes it does, even for produce nowadays. So we're going to try to figure out what are some of the carbon footprints of our food that we have in our homes. So before this workshop began, we sent out a list of materials that you might want to grab from home. And one of those materials was some sort of food item. It could be produce or it could be packaged. And we'll talk about the difference between those later. But what we're going to do is you're going to grab a food item from your house. If you need a minute to go grab it, go for it. We're going to have a few minutes to do this. And what you're going to do is grab that food item and look on it for the label. And you're going to try to find out where that food came from. Now, some of the food items that I have, only give me certain information. So if that food item doesn't work for you, you can grab a different food item. But I have an apple from Washington, it looks like. I have some tomatoes that came from Banning, California. So try to grab a food item that has a label on it. And we're going to use Google Maps to try to figure out the mileage that food traveled from that location to Oakland. So I'm going to post the link in the chat real quick. Actually, once I'm done explaining this, or you can open Google Maps on your own. And let's all just map it to Oakland because that's where Chabot is. So let's imagine you're at Chabot with me. If you're in LA, if you'd like to map it to your individual location, let's all map it to Oakland for the sake of this activity, because I want us to be able to compare how far our food traveled to one location. So even if you're in another city, let's map it from where it was produced to Oakland. You'll take your mileage that you get in Google Maps, and then you'll enter it into this little equation that I have. So if you have a pen and paper, feel free to multiply your mileage by 2.9. which is our kilograms of CO2 produced per ton mile, which I'll explain in a minute what that is. And that's your total kilograms of carbon dioxide emissions. When you're done and you have that number, you will post it and your other information into the Google Sheet that I just posted in the chat. So if you head to the chat, there's a Google Map link if you need help getting to Google Maps. It's already set to Oakland, I believe. And then for the Google Sheet, if you open that up, you'll see that there is kind of a data table for you to fill out. So you can type in what food item you had, what the location or the source was that you were found on your label, how many miles that was from where it was produced to Oakland. And then your total CO2 emissions, that's the number that you're going to get with this equation. So number of miles times 2.9, that's your total kilograms. And then the total CO2 emissions in tons, I already have an equation set in there that's going to translate your kilograms of CO2 emission into tons, which is the measurement that a lot of scientists will use to describe it. So do you have any questions on how we're doing this little activity? I'll give you a few minutes to kind of get everybody in there.
So I have a coconut from that was produced in Thailand, but there's another address that's in California. So which one should I go with?
Thailand.
Well, the kilograms per ton mileage that I have, this measurement is actually based on a study looking at the average emissions of a truck, like a freight truck. So let's do the one from California because that's probably traveling on the ground.
Okay.
If you have an item that probably had to fly via plane, we will talk a little bit more about that for when I get to my later slides, but that's obviously going to be a different emission scale when it's traveling via airplane versus truck versus smaller truck versus train, which is a whole world of opportunities that you could take this specific activity. But for today, we're keeping it kind of in this general. So yeah, if your item came from another country, ooh, good question. You can, will it give you mileage? We could imagine that a truck is driving through the ocean in today's situation.
I think the Google Maps is in kilometers, so I'm going to switch it to miles.
If it's in kilometers, go ahead and switch it to miles. So yeah, you'll multiply the number of miles from where it was produced or where your label says it's from to Oakland. And that is your mileage. And this 2.9 kilograms of CO2 is the average emission of a freight truck. And this is per ton mile. So this is based on a research paper that if a truck carrying 1 ton of that item traveled 1 mile, the average emission of a truck carrying 1 ton of equipment 1 mile is 2.9 kilograms of CO2 emissions. So we're using this based on one study. However, there's lots of different studies out there. They each have different rates because there's different factors that could be influencing this truck's emission, such as the weight of the truck, the gasoline that the truck is using, where the truck is going, elevation of the truck that it's traveling. All right, so got some good data.
I'm doing coffee from Colombia, and Google Maps is very concerned about my desire to travel across international borders during COVID. I'm getting all kinds of warnings.
I didn't think about that being a factor here. Oh, I should add mine in. Sweet potatoes. If you have more than one food item and you really want to do 2, you're more than welcome to. If you're into it. No. All right, we'll give you 1 more minute to get your foods into our chart.
And I will just note while people are doing that, I will just comment that on the Google Sheet, the charts that you have next to it, we shared in this week's news blast about the practice of slow reveal using data, incorporating it in your learning, and using kind of the slow reveal methodology. So you first look at the graph and you gradually add a little bit more information each time to, you know, what's the vertical axis, what's the horizontal axis, what are, you know, add some labels after students do some initial noticing. And that can be a really great practice for engaging students to think about what they're observing before they even have information about what the numbers or the lines are showing.
Yeah. So right now, just to let you all know, on this data sheet, the x-axis is your location, which I don't think it's showing just because it's like text. And then the y-axis is the, for the top chart, it's your total CO2 emissions. The bottom chart is the total emissions in tons. So from kilograms to ton, it's about a 0.001 ratio. From 1 kilogram is 0.001 tons. So we kind of have these two maps, these two data sheets that are showing us your CO2 emissions in kilograms on the top and CO2 emissions in tons on the bottom. And yeah, it's kind of fun to kind of watch them fill themselves in. I'm not a master Google Sheeter, so today was kind of an experiment. So thank you all for playing along. So we're going to take a look at the Google Sheet, basically kind of think about the footprints that we saw of our food. Before I go in and kind of start to guide us through this, does anyone want to share out what are some observations you made? What were some of the questions you had while we did this? Was there anything surprising? Was there anything not surprising? Looking at the differences between all of our different food items and where they came from. And you can unmute yourselves if you want to just.
I think it would be really powerful with the students once they start seeing some of the mileage that maybe the next time they're purchasing something, they consider purchasing something that's closer or at least in this country, because that would be less of a footprint.
Yes, yeah. A lot of the stuff I was looking at in my cupboard was like from different countries. And I was like, oh, that's far. Anyone else have any other interesting observations or share outs?
Someone mentioned interesting to compare food travel by truck versus food travel by plane. And I think also thinking about, and you know, obviously getting much more complex, but thinking about that obviously isn't for transporting one apple, that's for transporting a truck of apples. So how would you compare that down to, it's like, what is that really for my one apple?
Yeah.
How does that add up, right?
Yeah, totally. So when we used to do this workshop in person, we had tokens instead of a specific, you know, kilogram CO2 emission. So the tokens represent carbon dioxide. So if you're ever doing something like this in person, you can use something to represent CO2, which might be less math, or if you want more math, there's a lot more ways you could take this and break it down. So if you're carrying a ton of apples, this is the CO2 footprint for 1 ton of apples. So how many apples might that be per apple? What does that look like?
Oh,
So
great.
this is kind of a basic exercise to get us to look at how far something is. Oh, that's okay. If your information is still loading, Terry, I can just throw it in there for you. Is it 4:30? 4:35? All right. Terry, I got you. You're in there. So this is kind of a basic exercise for us to kind of see where different food items might be coming from and to compare how far they might be traveling and what that means for their actual footprint. So we have the furthest item with the biggest emission, I think, is the coffee from Guatemala. So congratulations, your coffee traveled really, really, really far. And it may have traveled more than just by truck. It may have traveled by plane. It may have traveled by boat. It may have traveled by railroad. And that actually goes for a lot of our foods on here as well. Followed up by the banana from Guatemala. I have a banana as well. And I was looking up earlier where Dole bananas come from. And it was like Central South America was like the only option for where my banana might have come from. So Hey, look, banana twins. Does yours say Guatemala?
No, I know that it was the Guatemalan blend that they were serving today. So I'm in my office. That was the only food I could grab.
So interesting. Yeah, some of my labels don't actually say where they're from. They're just really vague, which I don't know if that's just a labeling strategy or it's just the way it is. And then some of our lowest footprints on the opposite end, we had Tracy, your honeydew from Mendota was pretty small in terms of its footprint. We also had the bag of raisins from Joaquin Valley. That only had 580 kilograms of CO2 emitted, or 0.58 tons. And then we had a lot of in-betweens. So we had food coming from Washington, Pleasanton, Mexico, Torrance. Luckily, California has a lot of different foods and agricultural systems that are producing food, so they don't have to travel so far. But a lot of our food, like apples and bananas and certain produce, can only come from certain parts of the world where it grows best. So this is just kind of a quick exercise for us to just see what's out there, see what the carbon footprint of our food is. And something that you could do to extend this is take an entire lunch and find the whole footprint of one lunch, of one meal. You can break it down by individual item, or you can break it down as a group, what your entire class's footprint is of one lunch of one day. So there's a lot of different ways that you can take it. So thank you all for participating in our first activity. And yeah, I appreciate it. So when we think about the carbon footprint of our food, we're going to head back to our slides. There are lots of different steps to consider. And Teresa, you were mentioning this as well. And I think a few people may have mentioned it in our chat. So the journey from food, from its production to our actual tables, is more than just one transportation in one truck. It travels from a farm where it's grown, which has its own footprint based on the amount of energy used to grow that produce, and resources, if you're thinking about water and energy and time. And then that food from that farm is picked, and then it's sent to a packaging or processing place. So my sweet potatoes, the label specifically says it was distributed and sold at a Trader Joe's distributor that's in Monrovia. So these sweet potatoes may have come from somewhere else before they went to the Monrovia distribution center. So this footprint that I calculated may not even be the full piece of the puzzle. After they go from packaging to processing, they go to that distribution center, which is then going to send it out to different grocery stores, like your retail groceries. And then from there, that food may be going directly to your restaurant that you're going to, or directly to your homes if you're picking it up. So there's all these different steps that are part of our food's journey into our homes. And when we're looking at how that food is traveling, that can vary its footprint based on how it's doing that traveling. So this is some quick data from a study looking at the different impacts of getting food transported using a tanker, like a ship, railroad train, a freight truck, and an airplane. And just in this quick visual alone, which one do you notice has the biggest amount of CO2 emissions? Just right off the bat. We might notice that airplane has a really big footprint. It's almost like, I can't even think of the math. What's 0.2 to 1.1? It's a lot. And with every study that I was looking at going into creating this workshop, airplanes by far have an exponentially higher carbon footprint than any other way of transporting. So when we're getting foods from different countries because we want blueberries year round, and maybe blueberries can only come from Chile in the winter, we might have to fly that in, which is another piece of this larger puzzle. Another thing to consider is what kind of food that is. So many of us today, we're looking at produce like bags of raisins, apples, coconuts. Ooh, a persimmon, nice. Persimmons are super in season right now. But we can also think about other types of food, such as if you eat a lot of meat, And looking at the amount of carbon dioxide produced from making an animal product is exponentially higher than a produce. Does anyone want to throw out, why do you think that is?
Methane.
So the production of methane, which is gas produced by all of us, all organisms, and some deep sea vents and whatnot. That's another greenhouse gas that is produced. Anyone else have a guess? Why would the production of an animal product be so much higher than of a vegetable or fruit?
Feed.
Mm-hmm. Anything else?
Got some comments. Energy pyramid. There are a lot of food deliveries rather than people going to the store. The cow farts. lots of fart discussions will no doubt come up with students. And refrigeration, the need for refrigeration.
Yes. So when we're thinking about animal products, there is a lot of different types of energy being used just to produce that, mostly because of that energy pyramid. So a lot more energy is going into the production of feed, into the actual cost of maintaining a group of animals, such as beef, which is the highest producer of CO2 emissions than I think all animal products. And so that power of energy that we're putting in for just one piece of produce or of protein can be a really interesting pyramid to look at specifically. You could do an entire workshop just on this discussion itself and the studies that are out there. So this is another thing to consider when we're thinking about the footprint of our food. If your food item is a protein, such as an animal product, that footprint is also going to be larger. And then the last thing, there's actually two more things. One of the things to consider is also the food waste that we produce with our actual products, because as food breaks down, it also produces other greenhouse gases. So that is another consideration, and the production of actually taking care of that food waste. Like, I need to eat this banana today because it's about to go bad. But the process of taking in food waste where it needs to go, storing it and whatnot, that also has a part of our carbon footprint of our food. And then someone else said another thing, which is refrigeration, which is also another piece of this puzzle. Transportation of food is just one piece, but keeping that food actually cold, the right temperature, making sure that it doesn't rot or get moldy, also takes a lot of energy depending on the energy methods used to store that item. So there's tons of different puzzle pieces that can be used to bring in a big, larger conversation about how food is actually distributed, how it's stored, how it's packaged, how we consume it, and how we treat food. Because as one of you said earlier, it's also really important to be, grateful for the food items that we can get year round, but to think about the kind of the cost benefit of those food items is really important. And yeah, we have to think about the way that we actually recycle that waste, which at the end we'll talk about solutions, but we've already got someone saying vegetable waste can be composted. So there are some solutions and ways we can already avoid some of these factors to pick the ones that have a smaller footprint. So I like that you're already thinking that way. Wonderful. Cool. So this is kind of our first half, thinking about how food production itself, even though it's necessary and essential for all of us, we all need to eat food, it can have its own impact on the climate, because it is such a large industry that it contributes to a percentage of greenhouse gas emissions that we're seeing every year, which is contributing overall to the effects that we're seeing of climate change. But there's a backside to this coin. If you were to think about how the climate is changing, that's going to also affect the way that we produce food. Because if we're seeing a climate that's shifting, that means the way that we grow food, the way that plants and crops react to our planet, to our climate systems, to the day-to-day weather, that's also going to be influenced. So what we're going to do next is we're going to play a little bit of a game. I'm going to break it down for you first just to kind of explain, because in the virtual world, it's a little bit harder to play this game than when we used to be in person. But during this game, we're going to be talking about how certain aspects or effects of climate change are affecting the ability of farmers to grow food. And this is maybe large scale farms that we're talking about specifically. During the game, you're going to run into several different challenges. So I just kind of wanted to introduce you to your cast of characters of all the bad guys before we get into it. So we have things like unstable temperatures, which is one of the things we're seeing in climate change. We're seeing certain heat waves, but also cold snaps that can have an effect on the way you grow crops or keep plants alive. We're seeing drought, which is less water, less rainfall, lots of heat. We're seeing an increase of fungi, pests, and diseases because in a warmer, more humid climate, or just warmer climate, scientists know that fungi and pests and diseases are more likely to thrive in those environments. We're also seeing flooding. One of those secondary effects of climate change is interesting phenomena with sea level rising, which can affect the ways that we're seeing flooding on the coastlines, but also increased storms can lead to flooding. And we're also seeing unreliable pollinators. So the animals that farmers may be relying on to actually pollinate their plants, like bees or butterflies, some of these insects might be not as reliable because they're being affected by these changes in our climate. So these are some of the factors that you're going to come up against in this game. And what we're going to do for the game is I'm actually going to share a link in the chat. And it takes like 2 steps to get to this game. So give me a minute to help explain this. It was an interesting day the other day trying to figure out how to do this game in a virtual world. Okay, so I've just posted the link in the chat, which is going to send you to a page that looks like this. So this game was created online using an application called Twine, which is kind of like a choose your own adventure story game where you can actually make your own story for free. But to post it online, you have to go through some HTML work. It's a little complicated. So what you're going to do, you're going to click on that link and you're going to get a page that looks like this. This is not the game. This would be a really boring game. So what you're going to do is you're going to click on that little download button up in the right hand corner and then press direct download. And it should pop up somewhere on your screen. If you have like an ad blocker, it might not pop up. But what we're going to do is work in groups anyways. So as long as one person in your breakout room has the game up on their computer, you should be good to go because you're going to be working in teams. So just feel free to try to get that up if you can. Once you get the game, it'll be a green screen with a font that says choose your crop or something like that. So let me know if you're having trouble accessing that, but I'm going to move to the next screen if we're all okay.
It worked for me, so I don't know if anybody else has managed.
Cool. Feel free to chat me if it's not working and I can try to help you out. So what you're going to start with is this question saying, what crop do you want to grow? And I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to play this game with a small group. So I'm going to send you all into breakout rooms, or Teresa, if you want to send everyone into breakout rooms.
You'd need to make me the host if you want me to do it.
Okay. La, la, la. I think I can.
You made me a co-host, but only the host has the magical power to put people in breakout room.
You know what I'm thinking? I don't know if I have breakout rooms on this. I think we only have breakout rooms in something else. Oh wait, no, I'm on the wrong computer.
Yeah,
sorry everyone. So I'll send you into breakout rooms and you'll play with a smaller group of maybe like, I'll put you in groups of 3 to 4. And then as a team, you all can play through this choose your own adventure game. So basically you're going to come to points where you need to make a decision on what you want to do as a group of farmers, such as do you want to use pesticides or not? And there'll be a little bit of information below for you to kind of decide that together. And then at the end, you're going to find out how much of your crops you actually grew that season. But remember, during this game, you're also dealing with the effects of climate change. So there's going to be some unpredictable factors that you can't always get around. And so you'll choose your crop and you'll kind of follow the game, and then you'll end your season with a specific yield. During the game, I'd like you to try to play a few times, because I'll give you about 3 to 5 minutes to play this as a team. Keep track of your yields, which was successful, which were not. And then also I want you to think closely about what were the environmental factors that you came up across that were actually causing you to lose most of your crops. And like I said, we're going to get you to go into breakout rooms. So I can try to come into each room and see if there's a room that doesn't have it. I can drive for you. But if not, we could all come back together and just do it as one big team. So we'll try it. Let me, oh my gosh. Maybe I can't do breakout rooms, y'all.
Are there 3 dots in the lower right-hand corner?
Yes, but it's not. Usually we can, but for some reason I'm not seeing right now. And maybe it's because I'm in the different setting. All right, we're gonna play all together. We're playing as a group. Sorry to give you that link, but actually if you want to keep the link and play some other time, that's also totally cool with me. Okay, so can everyone see this game that I have up on the screen?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. So basically we're gonna play this game all together as a giant group. So we're gonna type into the chat the choices that we want, and we'll just go with whoever types first. So quick fingers here. We're gonna have to pick a crop that we want to grow. We can choose corn, bananas, or almonds.
Almonds seems to be the winner.
Okay. So the first question that we have is, how are we going to water our almond plants? We can choose between micro irrigation or conventional. There's a difference. One, with micro, our plants will be more likely to survive a drought, but our trees might produce fewer almonds. Conventional, our plants may not survive a drought, but our trees will produce more almonds.
We've got a split vote so far. We need someone to break the tie.
We have micro, conventional, and conventional. Conventional it is.
Getting conventional, there we go.
Okay, so we've picked conventional watering for our almonds. So now we have another decision to make. How do we want to pollinate our plants? We can do it naturally, which means our plants might have a harder time pollinating. So we're going to just kind of let the wind do it naturally, but we'll save money. Or we could use bees.
Everyone wants bees.
Yes, go bees. Okay, so our plants are pollinating. Good news, everyone. Because we used bees to pollinate, woo, 100% of our plants were able to pollinate. So we still have 100% of our crops. But now we have to continue into the summer. Let's see what happens. So it's summer and there was a huge drought. Because we used conventional watering methods, which needs a lot of water, 0 of our plants survived.
We got some I told you so.
Oh man. So you can think in your head, what were some of the environmental factors that we faced? And I'm gonna head it back to the start. And what were maybe the ways you would have done that differently? And we'll play again with a different crop to kind of get familiar with other pathways. So
have a vote for bananas.
We faced drought. Drought wiped out our almonds. Let's go to bananas. Okay, so how are we going to harvest our banana land? Imagine we have a farm. It's big, but it's not that big. We could either clear more land by cutting down the surrounding trees and plants to make more space. We'll have more space to grow bananas, but our fields might flood. Or we could use what we have, which means we have less space, but the forest will protect us. Okay, use what you have. I like it. Okay, so we are going to use what we have, and now we have to decide if we want to plant one kind of bananas, which means they may be more susceptible to disease, but they can pollinate easier, or 3 kinds, which means they won't catch disease, but it might have a harder time pollinating.
Lots of votes for 3.
Lots of 3s. Okay, so we've seen a tropical storm has caused a flood, but luckily, because we used what land we had, 80% of our plants survived. Woo! And only 20% were lost. So we're at 80% of our bananas. Wonderful. Now we're going to continue because the world keeps turning. And our next decision to decide on is whether we want to use fungicide. So fungicide is a chemical that can be sprayed on plants to kill diseases. You can decide to use it, which means that'll protect it, but it's more harmful impact on the environment. Or we cannot use fungicide, which means it's susceptible to disease, but it's better for the environment.
We've got mixed votes here, half and half. Let's see, it's starting to lean toward not.
Okay, we'll do not. Uh-oh, disease. It's infecting our fields, everyone. Because we didn't use it, only 50% of our plants survived. So 50% of the 80%. So if, say we had 10 plants to start with, we were at 8, now we're only at 4. Most farmers don't only plant 10 plants, but for the game's sake. So we didn't lose them all, that's good, but we lost a decent amount. So now we continue to the winter, and climate change caused a very dry winter, didn't get much rain. 80% of our 4 bananas, I think, survived, and 20% were lost. So our total yield of our banana season, we grew 30%, which is kind of a poor season, but that's okay because we saw all those different factors. Ooh, I like the question, no natural fungicide, you know, in this game, that would be a really good way to kind of extend it. At the moment, we just have a do or do not, but I like the idea of like alternative fungicide, which is a really good question. Do you want to do one more round with corn? We're going to do it.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. I didn't make the whole game for nothing. Okay, so we're going to plant our cornfield. How do we want to plant the corn? So we can either plant them close together, which means they have an easier time pollinating, but they might have a harder time surviving a drought, or farther apart, which means less pollination, but easier time in a drought.
Far seems, oh, well, now we're 50, oops. Let's see. We're on the fence. We need a tiebreaker.
I'm not a farmer, so a lot of this is like, just roll the die. I don't know.
Oh, we're still tied.
Okay, we're going far. I saw more
far. One more far. There we go.
Okay, so we're planting our corn far apart in our field, and now we have to decide when we want to plant it. We can do it now, which means we might grow more corn, but our plant might die if there's a late spring frost. Or we could do it in 2 weeks. We just wait. And we might grow less corn, but if there's a late spring frost, we can make it out.
We have a bunch of procrastinators who think it's better to wait and do it 2 weeks from now.
Same.
Someone said it's very stressful to have to make all these decisions.
I know, it's a lot. When we play this in the actual workshop, it's like around the room. So kids are like running everywhere. You could do this like interactively, but this is the modification for a virtual world. Luckily, y'all, there was a late spring frost, but our plant survived. So good decision, we procrastinated. So now we have to decide, how do we want to water our corn? We can do a flood soil method, which is when you use large sprinklers to water all of the crops at once, so lots of water, which could wash nutrients out. We might grow less corn, or we could use a drip system, which uses small hoses to drip water directly onto like each plant.
Drip seems to have the most votes.
All right, let's see. Okay, so it's spring. Think back, we planted our corn far apart. The plants are pollinating. Because we planted them far apart, 70% were able to pollinate. That's good. 30% were lost. Heading into summer, and there was a big old drought. Because we used a drip system, only 50% of our plants survived, 50% were lost. So heading into the end of our corn season, we only grew 30% of our corn. So we had a poor season. I promise there's other outcomes than poor or okay. So if you want and you have time later, you can play this game 1,000 ways if you'd like to. But I think you get the point. And that is that there's lots of different decisions that we have to make when we are planting our food and growing food.
Well, I like that somebody said, now you know why farming is so hard. So yes, a million of these. And for those of you teaching high school students, especially if you're in farming communities, I think an interesting way to build onto this activity would be incorporating choice in terms of the costs associated with these choices, right?
Mhm.
Oh, using bees or not using bees might be a very big cost decision. So being able to estimate without bees, I would lose, I wouldn't get as much fruits or vegetables pollinated or nuts versus with. So you can incorporate some of those cost factors once they've got the basic ideas to then add another level of complexity.
And remember also, especially with teenagers, protecting the environment has a cost itself.
Right.
I mean, that might mean less profit. That might mean better for the environment. So is it worth, producing a little bit less and marginalizing your profits for the benefit of the planet? And I think many teenagers would say yes, assuming their parents weren't farmers. But it's going to cost money and it's going to cost profits if we're going to protect the planet.
Exactly. And I had my coworkers play this game right before, and they all kind of said the same thing. They were like, I felt bad using fungicide because I don't agree with it, but yet I'm in this decision-making point where I have to decide between what I think is best and what is actually best for surviving. And when it comes to things like monetary decisions and financial decisions, it does cost money to build infrastructure, to put rules in place, to redesign equipment and machinery and materials, to actually make the change that we need to make. So it's a great decision opener or discussion opener on kind of how you make decisions and what drove your decision-making process. And it's interesting to see the decision-making process happen for 4th graders versus 8th graders versus high schoolers. It's going to be very different depending on their experience and their personal opinion.
One thing I think, though, that's not being taken into account is that people die when there's no food, so I mean, that trade-off, even for fertilizer or fungicide and all that, is 50 years ago we had a huge famine. I mean, not 50, maybe 100 huge famines where thousands and thousands of people died. We don't have that too much now here in America, but it still happens in other countries where you get too many locusts. So there's that toss up that, it's like, yes, I want to save the planet, but I also don't want to die, So
yeah,
for older kids, that's something you have to bring into account.
Definitely. There's a complete social aspect you can bring into this conversation that as we're seeing specific environmental conditions wiping out farmers' ability to produce food, that's also causing people that live in that area to migrate and to shift where they're living and to where they're going for their food sources, because not everywhere around the planet can ship blueberries in year round. And not even just blueberries, but the food that's essential for your survival.
Right.
So the food crisis that we might be seeing as our climate changes is actually going to shift where people are going, where people are moving, who can access food where. And of course, there's going to be a larger hierarchy structure of who can get food where and when. And that can play into those social structures that we have that will result in some people dying and some people not. And you kind of have that hierarchy system. So there's that direction you can take this, which is even deeper on that societal level. So I really appreciate that you bring that up.
Well, then we have the whole problem of who's going to actually pick the food, because nobody wants to do that.
Yes. Food is complex. It's really complicated. I'm going to kind of skip through this slide. I know we only have, well, I'm technically over on our 5 o'clock, Teresa. What do you want to do?
So I know that some people may have some time constraints, and I'm just going to paste into the chat. If you want to save that, you'll get it back by email. So if people do have time constraints and do need to hop off, you'll get a follow-up that'll have the links to the slides and the recording and any other resources to share out from this session. And if you have the ability to stay on for a few more minutes, Haley has a little bit more to share with us as we finish up, and you can have time to answer some questions. So I will, acknowledge that some people may need to hop off, but we're okay to continue for a few more minutes. What do you think, Haley? You have about 5 more minutes or so?
Yeah, sure. I'll just kind of skip through like how you would conclude something like this, which obviously we're kind of already starting to do. So kind of just breaking down the impacts on climate change, what that means for food, which we've already talked about kind of on the way in. So how these specific factors can actually influence the way that crops are produced and the challenges that we're seeing, which I kind of introduced before we played the game. And this feedback loop. So essentially the point of this workshop is talking about this feedback loop that exists between human needs, human actions, and the planet. And how as we continue to produce food in ways that might not be great for the planet, but for the necessity of our survival, this has some sort of impact on the climate. And as the climate changes, that has some sort of impact on the food that we're producing, which is in return causing us to produce it in specific ways, in specific locations, and make decisions that might not necessarily be great for the environment and feeds back into that loop. So this cycle can feel really overwhelming, and it can feel really complex and complicated, especially when most of the production of these emissions are coming from large-scale factories, large-scale industries, and it's not necessarily just on our individual shoulders to solve this entire problem, because there are entire systems that are in place that are impossible to break down right here and now, because we still need food, and there's still kind of this capitalistic society we have built, which can challenge the way that we access food. And then typically I would conclude a workshop like this with a discussion about solutions. So obviously leaving your students with hope. And some of the main points that we typically bring up in terms of this content on food is obviously trying to shop local. This is part of the solution. Shopping local can really only reduce your emissions by so much, because all of those other factors that I had mentioned, such as the type of food that you're purchasing, whether it's an animal product or not, can have a much bigger impact. You can choose to forego beef in one store trip, and that would actually reduce your footprint by the same amount of you driving to the store back and forth 10 times. So there's a different ratio scale that you can look at, how your decision making can make a greater impact in one action versus lots of little actions as an individual.
Haley,
Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I love this. I love the way you adapted it too from what we used to do at Chabot. It's awesome. I'm thinking a powerful way to close the loop, no pun intended, but might be to come back to the carbon footprint activity. Now that the students have got a sense of the different things, they could think about their own lunches like we used to do, and then how they might, change their lunches to be have a lower carbon footprint. So we get to that, this discussion you're bringing up now about what they can do. Food is so accessible to kids, and we all, make choices about what we put in our mouths and what we buy, and we can, the students can rally their parents for a meatless Monday or, whatever it is, but it might be neat to come back to the carbon footprint thing that we started with, and,
Yeah, I love that. So yeah, think about the solutions to the things that we already looked at. So if your grapes came from Chile, like maybe try to buy grapes from Monrovia or, Pleasanton. But, we don't always have that choice, especially for students. So also having that honest discussion with them on who purchases the food for your household? How do you get food for your household? Is food something you have access to in your household? Can also be another discussion you can bring in here, because not everyone has access to all of these food options. And then other solutions you can take to a community level. So thinking of food waste recycling, such as composting, food waste reduction. So actually buying food in smaller quantities when you go to the store to reduce your waste from the start, which will also work its way up the demand chain eventually. If there's less demand, there will be less supply, which can reduce the amount of waste we're just producing from agriculture producers as well. Voting, if your students are of age to vote, you can also get them politically involved in different rules, different actions, different laws, proposals around the specific content of agro. And then you can obviously have conversations, which is the easiest place to start, with your family, friends, with your class, and whatnot. And so, yeah, that's kind of how we would wrap this workshop up. For everyone's time, that's it. I had a few just questions for you all of what was helpful, what would you adapt? But I think we did a pretty good job at talking about how you might adapt something like this for your classroom. If you were to take this with your students, depending on their age, there's a lot more you can do at different ages, but also good to keep in mind it's powerful to start them young. So yeah.
And thanks, Haley, particularly for bringing in the student agency, right? So some students, if they rely, for example, on school lunch and that's provided by the school, they don't really have any agency over some of those decisions. But there might be other things that they could have agency over. For example, making sure the trash gets put in the proper places and sorted out and recycled, right? So thinking about where, the level of students you have, and where they are able to have some agency and have some hope that they're having a positive impact as you share and build in this data. That's really terrific. So I really appreciate this way, the visuals and the graphics that you've shared, and we'll share these slides out. They're awesome, and I think they would make really powerful inclusion. I like the carbon footprint slide in particular. That was really great with all the different aspects. I wanted to let teachers know that I put 2 links in the chat, and you'll get them in the follow-up email. So they will have both the resources from this event, and then we also have a separate page that we are continuing to curate that has all kinds of resources for teaching around environmental and climate literacy, including lessons, teacher toolkits, student action projects, citizen science, all of those various ways that you might look to build out robust learning for your students, even in this distance environment. And as we go back into hybrid and various models over the coming year. So we are here to continue answering your questions and helping you field your challenges as you think your way through this. And we're also hoping to build some professional learning communities among the teachers who have been active in the sessions this fall. So thank you so much for joining. And Haley has included her email there. So if those of you have any questions.
Yeah, or if you just want to ask ways you could modify or adjust for your own class, or if you ever want to brainstorm, just hit me up. We're here for you.
And Sherry, thanks for sharing that question about the frustration with the school-based recycling, because that is something that we encounter consistently across so many school districts, where individual schools get very excited about it, but the district has a garbage contract and it's all just recycle theater because the kids do it and then the janitors take it out and it all gets dumped into the same dumpster that serves the school. So we know that there's a long way to go, and there are places for kids to be able to take agency, but understanding where those are can really be challenging.
Yeah,
you guys
Go ahead.
You guys be sending out certificates so we can get them to our district for ours?
Yeah, so everybody who attends, you'll get an email along with these resources. There'll be a certificate verifying these hours, and if anybody on here is looking to get the academic CEU, which is a total of 10 hours over the course, you can look at that page and attend, chart your own path through there, and then reach out and we'll do the paperwork to get you that. So there's both options. Yes. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Well done.
Have a great rest of your day, and thank you so much, Haley.
Yeah, thank you all for joining and your interest and your participation. I really appreciate it. And yeah, go out and change the world.